So many people right now struggle to find and keep and deepen their friendships. What is going on? Research shows that the people you hang out with have a bigger effect on how your life goes than just about anything else in your life. They influence the choices you make. They influence the standards you set for yourself. They influence the other people that you're going to meet. But the weird thing is, people hardly talk about this. We talk about romance and how to date, but did anyone ever teach you how to have friends? No. It's assumed that we'll just pick it up by osmosis or from our families. But if this isn't something your parents modeled for you or couldn't model it for you because they were really limited or damaged in this area too, you are so not alone. Especially for people who grew up with trauma. Learning to have friends and be a friend is so tricky. Maybe you struggle to have friends, or you have friends, but the relationship stays on the shallow end. You don't get close. Or you get close, but then your trauma symptoms get the better of you, and something happens to trigger you, and the whole thing blows up. Big argument or a little argument that you can't really recover from, and the friendship crumbles. Has this ever happened to you? If you grew up with abuse and neglect, there's a high probability that having friends is a part of life that gets hard for you sometimes. And this is a big reason why unhealed trauma can be so devastating to your life over time. You end up isolated. You don't have those people who love you and get you and who are there for you when you need them. And this is really important. Not having that is a big setback, and I'm sure it's robbed you of the life that you deserve in some ways already. But the good news is this can change. And you can heal. And the path of your life can start getting better right now if you can develop some friendship skills and learn to form friendships with good people. This is something I had to really work on in my life. My trauma symptoms kind of got worse over time in my early adulthood. And so the good friends that I had were starting to pull away. And I didn't know what was wrong. But now I know. Now we all know. It's complex PTSD, and it has a common pattern of symptoms that once you know what they are, even if you haven't totally healed them yet, can clarify what may have been going wrong in your friendships and what part of those problems is something you can change. So here's what I learned. First, it's so important that you pick the right people for friends. Because if you're like a lot of people with childhood PTSD, you find that troubled people have a mysterious allure for you. What is it about them? They feel so charmingly comfortable, so unthreatening, so much like home. And maybe you have a history of buddying up with the most troubled person in the class, or somebody who turns out to have a drug problem, or people who are really not available to be good friends. So the first thing is to start identifying who would be the good, healthy people for you to hang out with. We talk about this a lot in my dating and relationships course because this broken picker problem is very common for people with childhood PTSD. But the way you choose friends can be just as rickety. And the key is to get clear with yourself, to actually write down what characteristics are absolutely essential. So let's say for you, it's that the other person is kind. They're honest. They reciprocate your interest in the friendship. You don't have to know these people yet, but you're defining what the right people are like. And then you also spell out what characteristics you cannot have in friends. And this might be characteristics where you had a blind spot before, and you know it brings your life down. I used to have that blind spot for people who had serious drug addictions. And first I wouldn't see it, and then I would see it, but be too afraid of loneliness not to pull away from them. And actually, I had no business hanging out with serious addicts. I was never into drugs myself, but that's what I grew up with. And that's where I felt at home, I guess. And so I'd use fuzzy reasoning to rationalize staying friends with people with serious addictions. And it would introduce all kinds of trouble into my life. Drama, shame, people stealing my stuff. And it didn't fit with the other parts of my life where I was fairly functional. I had to make a decision that I could not have that in my life anymore. Not with the blind spot and the way that I couldn't seem to keep boundaries at the time. So you can write down what your lines are. What characteristics are a big no way for people that you let into your life, and those that are must-haves. And this helps keep certain people out And as you may be fearing, it's true that setting boundaries about who can be in your life could introduce a period of loneliness. At first, it might be most of the people you know are really on the wrong side of that line. So you end some friendships and the new people haven't arrived yet. You haven't found them yet. Now, I know that finding good, healthy people is easier said than done when you had a crappy childhood. And sometimes trauma symptoms show up that make things harder. Maybe you get emotionally intense and you fall apart, or friends might stand by you at first, but part of the falling apart is it makes a person very inwardly focused. And in the long run, that inward focus that you kind of have to have when you're going through a big change, it can push people away. Or worse, maybe your stress comes out as a tendency to criticize and blame your friends when you're feeling overwhelmed. So there's conflict and they don't want to deal with that, so they pull away. Or maybe you're the one who pulls away. These are common trauma-driven reactions to ordinary stress that can happen in a friendship. And even if you're able to keep your feelings under control enough not to ruin everything in a big explosion, that kind of self-control can really limit the depth of a relationship. It can limit how much fun the friendship can be. There's not the deep connection and trust between you and your friend that would be needed for the friendship to last. And so over time, it fades out. It's a sad and hard part of trauma healing, and this part of it can be so hard to change. But you can change these dynamics by working on yourself. So one of the first things that you can do to have great relationships is just pick good people and then work overtime to be a good friend. When you want to hang out with somebody, I would suggest, if it's at all awkward, invite them to do something with you. So not just random hanging out, but an activity. With good friends, it's normal to get together without a plan or an activity. And that's really good when you're with somebody who you're already close with. But if you're just getting to know somebody, doing some kind of activity can kind of take the focus off the interpersonal dynamics. A little bit of that focus is good, but a lot can be too much early on. So one of my favorite examples is bowling. Actually, the bowling alley near us closed during the pandemic. But I always thought of bowling, like if you go to a movie with somebody, you can't talk. And if you go to a restaurant, you have to talk. But like bowling, you kind of talk and you do the activity. And if things get a little weird or you need a little breather, you can just focus on the bowling for a minute and then come back to the conversation. So doing things, it does help. The next thing is about being a good listener. Now, everybody knows this, but try this, all right? When you get together with your friend, spend 30 minutes just doing an experiment. Only listen to them. Don't talk about yourself, and instead focus on listening and responding to what they're saying about themselves. Now, I'm not saying do this forever, but just as an experiment and as a practice. Listen to the other person and reflect on what they're saying and give them feedback. But the point is not to talk about yourself, just for this experiment. What we normally do if we're in a conversation. Oh, that happens to you, me too. That happens to me. Well, one time, and then you're telling a story about something. So it's natural to relate information about yourself when someone tells you something. That's a way many of us think we're being a good friend, and sometimes that is how we're being a good friend. But when it goes too far, it can make the other person feel interrupted and deflated about something they were trying to say. So it's good to really hear what someone is trying to say, to really hear it. That's how you can get closer to that person. So for 30 minutes, just try not talking about yourself, just for exercise, and it will teach you a lot. My husband and I've told this story before, but we went to a party once where we didn't really know people, and we were nervous. We were worried that we'd have nobody to talk to. So we came up with a game that we would play. It's just a strategy to make the evening fun. We made a rule for ourselves, secret rule, and we didn't tell anyone else. And for the whole party, we only listened and talked about what other people were saying. We didn't talk about ourselves. And it was funny because we were so popular. We got invited by 2 other couples to have dinner sometime. And that normally wouldn't have happened. And they didn't know anything about us. And they never asked about us. They just wanted to have dinner because we were asking about them. So it didn't actually come to any dinners, but it was an interesting lesson to me that a lot of people are not good listeners, but just about everyone is hungry to be listened to. Here's another thing to keep in mind, and it's another form of good listening. is don't give unsolicited advice. And if someone says, oh, I had a hard day yesterday, I had a headache all day, you don't have to jump in and tell them what to do about headaches. They're not really telling you about the headache unless people specifically ask for advice. What do I do about headaches? What do you do? It's just so much better to listen and hear what it is they really wanted you to hear, which is that they had a hard day. It was so hard, they had a headache, and that's what they wanted you to know. And then you can say, wow, that does sound like a hard day. What did you do? And that's how a friend listens. Now, similarly to that, you can give them affirmation. That's a word of praise, recognizing something good about them, a compliment. People like to be appreciated more than you might think. And obviously, you shouldn't do it too much. But when you can give a sincere compliment, make it a clean compliment. Don't say, oh gosh, your hair is so pretty, but mine is awful. That's not clean. You're putting them on the spot to say something about your hair. And a clean compliment is you go, you know what? Your hair looks really gorgeous like that. It looks great. It's such a good styling for you. That's it. And you just make it clean, a nice clean compliment for them. People like it and they need encouragement, and they like it when their accomplishment or the good things about them are noticed. That's just a good friend thing to do, is to notice and encourage what's good. Here's another good listening thing. When your friend has told you about a big thing they're expecting, maybe they're giving a speech or an event next week, or they tell you about something that was hard, like they recently had shoulder surgery, a good friend follows up on that, maybe calls them a few days later and says, well, how did the speech go? Or how's your shoulder doing today? If you think about it, the people who do that for you, those are the people who you end up closest with. And that's like showing up for people and actually paying attention. Not just in the moment, in the conversation, but over time. Time, that's what a good friend is. If you want to have a friend, you've got to be a friend. And if you want to have a good friend, you've got to be a good friend. Another thing is to be a believer in your friend. Everybody has self-doubt, and when we become friends with people, we'll begin to reveal what our doubt is. So your friend might say something like, well, I'm thinking about changing jobs, but I think I might be kidding myself that anyone would ever hire me. Well, you know what a good friend is? It's somebody who sees your very best potential and believes in you and can express that to you and remind you of your strengths and why you are employable and supports you in finding ways to make that happen. So that's how to be a believer in your friend. I think for a lot of people, we tend to think that if we don't put somebody down, then we're not causing any harm. But actually, people need to have a witness that they're doing something right and that there's potential for them to do something even better. So good friends can believe in the best possible outcome and always encourage a friend toward the next step. A good friend also shows up for the hard stuff, and that means picking people up in the airport and visiting them in the hospital and helping them move their furniture and sitting with them when they're grieving, when they've lost a loved one or a relationship. And I know that when there was a period in my life where I had a lot of tragedy, I really found out who my friends were. And a lot of people who I thought were good friends, they disappeared. They didn't help. They didn't even call. Or they'd say, let me know if there's anything I can do. But of course, when you're grieving or you've been through surgery or something, you don't know what you need. So there are these special people who know how to ask you if you need help. And they might suggest a thing or two, like, would it help if I picked up some groceries on my way over there? Would it be okay if I washed these dishes? It was the people who did that, who took the time to come see me in the hospital, even though it was far away and so boring and hard to park. And they made a huge difference in my life right when I was the most depressed. And they encouraged me, and they took me for walks around the corridors. And in the long run, those are the people who became lifelong friends. It's a beautiful thing to do for other people. So you want to show up for the good times, the weddings and the parties and the celebrations, but you also want to show up for the hard times. A good friend shows up for the good and the bad. And you never want to talk behind their back. And I'm just going to say this. You don't really want to say anything bad about anybody who's not present, but especially your friends. Don't ever talk about them behind their back. And even if you know for a fact they're never going to know, just on the off chance that the energy reaches them, our nervous systems, they do communicate with each other. So, people you love can sense sometimes that there's a rupture there. So you don't want to talk about your friends behind their back. Have their back. Protect their identity. Protect who they are. Protect their hearts. And finally, stay in touch with them. And this is one of the terrible things about contemporary times, is that we think, well, I said hello on Instagram and I texted happy birthday. But if you're not talking to people face to face, or at least on the telephone, it's really hard to sustain a close friendship. Messaging on social media, it's not nothing, but for these purposes, it doesn't count. So whenever you can, see people face to face. And if you can't see them face to face, talk on the phone or video chat. And if you can't talk on the phone, send an email. And if you can't send an email, send a text. And if you can't do that, okay, fine. Talk to them on social media. But these are some of the ways that you can be a better friend. And if you want a free download where I list these friendship skills, you can get one for yourself right now by clicking right here. It's free. And I will see you very soon.